all except for now to introduce tonight's speaker and to thank Penny Howard, who's our sponsor for tonight's lecture. Thank you, Penny. Are you here somewhere? Hi, Penny. Thank you very much. Well done. Yeah, Mark Roberts, who was for close on 40 years the librarian at the British Institute of Florence. Mark and I were young men together here in Florence in the late 70s when I was teaching a bit of English, and Mark had just started out in this much more superior and important job of managing the library, which he went on doing until I came back again, and he's still here. And I was delighted to see that things had evolved slowly at the Institute. And Mark is still a very close friend of the Institute and is one of our absolute star lecturers. So it really doesn't need much more introduction than that. Over to you, Mark.
Well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. You in the room and you who are joining us on Zoom. This talk is dedicated to the memory of Inga-Laura Levkovich. I think that the story of the Jewish ghetto of Florence is not at all well known. Certainly, it was known to me only in the haziest of outlines when last summer I was asked to translate the catalogue for an upcoming exhibition on the subject, curated by Pier Gabriele Mancuso, Alice Leger, and Sefi Hendler. My thanks go to them for allowing me to share the results of their painstaking archival and documentary research. If I now give the impression of knowing something about it, it is entirely due to these three and to their excellent team of contributors. This etching of Jews in a synagogue was made by Rembrandt van Rijn in 1648. The Jewish presence in Tuscany is documented from between the 9th and the 11th century, with the rise to power in Florence of Cosimo il Vecchio in 1434, and even more decisively with that of Lorenzo il Magnifico in 1469, the city became an economic and cultural capital also for the Jews. For the circle of Lorenzo got on well with them and warmly welcomed their presence. Lorenzo himself was interested in Hebrew culture. Humanists such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola studied Hebrew with Jewish teachers and took an interest in the Kabbalah. Learned Jewish scholars such as Abraham ben Mordecai Farisol immersed themselves in Christian Renaissance scholarship. Farisol, seen on the right, had fruitful relations with the enlightened court of Ercole d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and in Florence with the circle of Lorenzo il Magnifico. An example of Jewish culture admiringly incorporated into the circle of Lorenzo is this sacred representation, Judith Hebrea, probably performed for Lorenzo and his friends, though not printed until the following century. The subject, the beheading of the Assyrian general Holofernes by the Jewish heroine Judith, was a favorite one with the Medici, ever since they had commissioned a bronze statue of it by Donatello in 1450. Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, had composed a poem about Judith, perhaps in the 1470s. As regards the hidden meaning of this sacred representation, the wicked Assyrian king Nabucodonosor would represent the Medici's enemy, Pope Sixtus IV della Rovere, and the king's besieging army would stand for the anti-Judaic and anti-Medicean forces whose hostility was fomented and stirred up by certain Florentine preachers. On the right, we see Sandro Botticelli's painting of Judith returning with her maid to Betulia, carrying the severed head of Holofernes, while on the left we see the printed edition that was issued in Florence at the Scala di Badia. The angel with the lily appears in many printed sacred representations. In the woodcut beneath, you can just make out Judith inside the tent of the drunken Holofernes, about to chop off his head. Even though the activity of Jewish moneylenders in Florence is documented from the early 14th century, it was not until 1437 that the Republic officially granted to Abraham da San Miniato the right to establish 3 banks in the city. As well as their financial and commercial activity, the bankers played a leading role in culture, promoting the creation of schools, transcribing Hebrew manuscripts, and maintaining lively intellectual exchange with other communities, both inside and outside the Italian peninsula. The exponents of the banking families operating in Florence and in other Italian cities were also poets, exegetes, storytellers, tutors, philosophers, astronomers, astrologers, Talmudists, and Kabbalists. For instance, Yechiel da Pisa, probably the richest of 15th century Jewish moneylenders in Tuscany, took an interest in science, philosophy, and Kabbalah, as is shown by the manuscript works he commissioned or copied out for his own use, now dispersed in libraries all over the world. In 1488, Yechiel managed to convince Lorenzo de' Medici to expel from Florence the anti-Semitic Franciscan preacher Bernardino da Feltre. In the early 16th century, David Reuveni was impressed by the precious clothing and refined tastes of Yechiel's descendants, who devoted themselves to sacred music and transcribing the Torah, and by their wives, who played the harp, sang, danced, and made precious embroideries. My slide shows a couple of pages from the Rothschild Mahzor, illuminated in 1492, the year that the Jews were expelled from Spain. The Mahzor is the prayer book that is used on the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot. Thanks above all to epistolary testimony, we know that the Tuscan Jewish elite followed the same conventions as contemporary Gentile society. For example, the merchant traveler Mechelin da Volterra, 1440 to 1508, well known for his Holy Land travel diary, corresponded with Lorenzo de' Medici, from which correspondence we gather that rich Jews were accustomed to hunt with the falcon. Young Jews took part in feasts where they danced with their non-Jewish contemporaries. One of the best-known dancing masters of the time was the Jew, Guglielmo da Pesaro, author of a treatise on dancing. In it, Guglielmo, shown in the middle of the picture on the left, defends dancing as a noble art and stresses the important role of music. He describes qualities necessary for dancers, including posture, musicality, style, and memory, and provides first-hand accounts of massive court celebrations in which he took part. This Bible, a perfect combination of Hebrew textuality and Christian decorative tradition, dates from the second half of the 15th century and was part of the collection of Lorenzo de' Medici, a manuscript of extraordinary beauty and elegance. It contains the text of the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, in square italic lettering in 2 columns. The codex was copied out by Yitzhak ben Obadiah da Forli, one of the leading Jews of his time, who is thought to have converted to Christianity. This is because the volume contains some Christian prayers, including a Trinitarian formula and an address to Christ, written in Hebrew. Uncertainty shrouds the identity of the author of the stupendous decoration, which some scholars think could be by Francesco Rosselli. The first word of the book of Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning, is written in golden characters, much larger than the rest of the text, on a golden ground, something rather unusual in a Hebrew context, presumably borrowed by the scribe from the milieu of Christian scriptoria. This small volume, A Prayer Book for Women, is another example of a collaboration between a Hebrew scribe and a Christian illuminator. In this case, Mariano del Buono. Dating from the later 15th century, it gathers together a good part of the liturgical lectionary, according to the Italian rite, the parts intended both for individual and collective recitation, from morning blessings to the celebration of the Shabbat, of Hanukkah, Purim, and Pesach. Since there is no colophon, it is unfortunately not possible to identify the patron, but it is certain that this prayer book was intended for women, since various passages that in the traditional lectionary are given in the masculine gender, in particular the morning blessings, appear here in the feminine form. In Renaissance Florence, there was a fruitful interchange between Jewish and Christian scholars. The Christian Giannozzo Manetti, 1396 to 1459, for example, applied to Emanuel da San Miniato to refine his knowledge of the Hebrew language. And on his part, Emanuel translated the Hebrew Psalms into Latin. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola was helped by the distinguished Ashkenazi Joachim Alemanno to penetrate deeper into the mysteries of Midrashic and Kabbalistic exegesis of sacred scripture. This painting by Jean-Baptiste Chardin is entitled Le Philosophe Lisant and is now in the Louvre. The sitter is thought to be the painter Joseph Aved, a Jewish friend of Chardin. The first Jewish ghetto in Europe was the one set up in Venice in March 1516 by the Doge Leonardo Loredan and the Venetian Senate. The etymology of the word is disputed, and none of the many explanations put forward over time is at all reliable. The Venetian Jews were forcibly segregated into an area of the Cannaregio Sestiere in Venice, an outrageous violation of their civic rights that unfortunately was copied by other cities. This painting is by Vittore Carpaccio. Remember Shakespeare's Shylock from The Merchant of Venice. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? On the 14th of July, 1555, Pope Paul IV Carafa promulgated the bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, which established the Roman ghetto. Iniquitously, the bull obliged the Jewish community of Rome, which had existed since pre-Christian times, and now numbered about 2,000, to live constrained within a section of the city that was locked up at night. It revoked the rights of the Jewish minority and forbade Jews to own property even inside the ghetto. Jewish physicians were forbidden to attend Christian patients. Every Saturday, the Holy Jewish Shabbat, Roman Jews were obliged to listen to compulsory Christian sermons preached in front of the small church of San Gregorio a Ponte Quattro Capi. With his mane-like hair and shaggy beard, Paul IV was an alarming figure. St. Ignatius of Loyola is said to have trembled in every bone when he heard of Cardinal Carafa's election. The Florentine ambassador wrote that the Pope is a man of iron, and the very stones over which he walks emit sparks. Beggars were expelled from Rome, prostitutes were whipped and imprisoned. The creation of the Roman ghetto was in line with Paul's repressive policies. In Florence in the 1560s, there emerged from the woodwork one of those petty but dangerous anti-Judaic bureaucrats with whom the history of Germany in the period 1933 to 1945 has made us painfully familiar. The eldest son of Alessandro Pitti and Maddalena Capponi, Carlo Pitti, 1522 to 1586, was the pen pusher most deeply implicated in the establishment of the ghetto of Florence in his capacity as Soprasindaco dei Nove. A supporter of the expulsion of the Jews from ducal territory, he was responsible for the census of the Jewish population in 1568 and for identifying the site of the ghetto. In the service of Cosimo I and his son Francesco I, Carlo Pitti held important offices from the 1540s, and in 1575 he was made a senator. This portrait of him was attributed by Berenson to Santi di Tito, while the medal on the left is by Gaspare Romanelli and shows Pitti in senatorial robes. Despite his brilliant career, the senator was not admired by his contemporaries, and indeed was described by Giuliano de Ricci and Bastiano Arditi as an unjust, proud, greedy, and corrupt functionary, characteristics that are reflected in the virulence of his anti-Semitic attitude and in the zeal with which in 1570 he collected evidence of supposed crimes committed by Jews in Tuscany. So the attitude of Cosimo I de' Medici towards the Jews, which had been relatively amicable and favorable, changed in that year radically and irrevocably. With the Grand Ducal Decree issued on 26 September 1570, the state of Cosimo I took a fatal step in relations with the Tuscan Jewish community, which, with the sole exceptions of Livorno and Pisa, would from then on suffer severe segregation and the imposition of the humiliating life of the ghetto. Jews would be forbidden to employ Christian servants, to interact with Christians, apart from in restricted professional circumstances, and to possess immovable property. These rules derived in large part from the traditional canon law of the Roman Church. They had fallen into abeyance and were now revived. It would, moreover, and above all, be forbidden to lend money at interest. Like the papal bull of 1555, which set up the ghetto of Rome, and like the deliberations of the Venetian Senate in 1516, the document issued by Cosimo comprises several sections. The first part sets out the reasons for the ghettoization, a presumed and generalized failure on the Jewish side to obey the money lending regulations, and the obvious need to put an end to the scandal of Judeo-Christian cohabitation. The second part articulates the modes of imposing the ghetto and explains the principal norms that the Jews will have to observe. The edict follows and responds to the data collected by the census of the Jewish population conducted by Carlo Pitti and by the Magistrato Supremo in 1568, from which it emerged that in the whole of Ducal Tuscany, excluding Livorno, there were a few more than 700 Jews. This is a very small number, especially if compared with other parts of Italy. My portrait of Cosimo in Arma is by Agnolo di Cosimo, known as Bronzino. The bronze bust is by Benvenuto Cellini. In September 1569, Pope Pius V Ghislieri elevated Cosimo to the rank of Grand Duke, and he was crowned in Rome the following year, as you see in this picture. Beneath his red camaro and mozzetta, Pius wore a white cassock. He was the first pope to do so and has been imitated by all his successors. The chronological coincidence between the two events, the coronation and the establishment of the ghetto, has been endlessly debated by historians in the attempt to discover whether there was a relationship of cause and effect between them. In other words, was Cosimo's new repressive and segregationist attitude to the Jews the direct result of his new close relations with the papacy? It seems to me very likely that it was. Under Cosimo, seen here in his Grand Ducal robes and crown, the Florentine ghetto was constructed very rapidly, and the work took no more than 2 years, so that it was all ready by 1572. The area in which the ghetto was built was one of the most central zones of the city, corresponding to the ancient Roman center, the Gonfalone del Drago, in the quartiere of San Giovanni. It was no distance at all from the Duomo and the Palazzo Vecchio, respectively the religious and the civic poles of Florence. It was a rather sleazy area, and we read of many low taverns, gambling dens, and rooms rented to worldly women, as the pleasant euphemism went. In the mid-16th century, the priest and diarist Agostino Lapini described it more bluntly as being composed of houses, warehouses, whorehouses, and shops, and other buildings where public prostitutes spend much time. Prostitution in Renaissance Florence was regulated by the Office of Decency, known as the Onestà, which was set up in April 1403, and that year the city officially opened its first public brothel. The Grand Duke purchased properties on the site for a total of 2,753 florins, so that the ghetto remained Grand Ducal property. The Jews had to pay rent. The total cost for setting up the ghetto was 4,339 florins. A painter was paid for painting the Grand Ducal arms above the entrance gate. With monstrous hypocrisy, Cosimo presented himself in an inscription as a great benefactor of the Jewish people. At the conclusion of work, the ghetto instituted by Cosimo I comprised 33 shops and 89 apartments for a total of 328 rooms, divided into 6 quarters, each organized around a stack that gave access to the internal lanes of the ghetto. A large public well was located in the center of Piazza della Fonte, while 12 more wells, probably the remains of those dug by the families before the ghetto, supplied the interiors of the houses. The buildings had no more than 3 floors, like most houses in the city, although gradual overcrowding led over the years to a few floors being added. The community possessed 2 synagogues, one of the Italian Rite and one of the Sephardic Levantine Rite, which both faced onto the central piazza, while the small Corte del Macello, as its name suggests, was used as a slaughterhouse and for butchers' shops. There was, of course, a Hebrew school for the children, such as we see in this photograph. There was a mikveh, or ritual bath, used for religious ablutions and for purifying objects, supplied with fresh running water. The ghetto had only 2 entrances that were controlled by the Medici authorities, as well as various spaces used for community and cultural purposes. In the Museo di San Marco, here in Florence, there are some fragments of stone fragments with Hebrew inscriptions, precious physical survivals from the ghetto. Another precious physical survival from the ghetto is this rimon on the left. Rimonim are the finials set on the tips of the Torah scroll handles. This rimon is the only surviving one of a pair and is one of the oldest Italian examples, demonstrating how already at this date, circa 1580, the form was inspired by architecture rather than by the object's literal meaning. Rimon is the Hebrew word for pomegranate. The tower structure is grafted onto a circular section stem, interrupted by moldings, and rests on a bean-shaped cup which supports a frame from which hang 6 drop-shaped bells. The central body, with a hexagonal section, has fictive niches on each face, with drapes and tassels alternating with bunches of fruit surmounted by shell valves. In the corners, there are shaped columns slightly apart, which support an architrave on which rests a balustrade and the dome crowned by a bud. The ceremonial object was made by a Florentine but non-Jewish silversmith in the last quarter of the 16th century. 100 years after its institution in 1570, the ghetto of Florence in the late 17th century was undoubtedly a more porous and open reality than had been the intention of its promoters, who had conceived it as an instrument of repressive segregation for the Jews. Not only did almost half the Jewish population of Florence live in the so-called fuori ghetto, i.e. outside the perimeter of the area of forced residence, but the Jewish quarter itself was traversed daily by multitudes of Christians who exercised various professions there, or who came to purchase goods of every possible kind that were available in the shops. Moreover, there were numerous transitory foreign Jews of different conditions, from vagabonds and beggars from Central and Eastern Europe to North African rabbis and distinguished visitors from the Holy Land. These black and white photographs are obviously not from the Florentine ghetto. They're from the ghetto of Lodz, which the Germans called Lichmannstadt. This is Rembrandt's wonderful painting known as The Jewish Bride, now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. The distinctively Jewish art form of illustrating the marriage contract, or ketubah, plural ketubot, has a long history that begins in the Egypt and Palestine of the early Middle Ages, and then spreads to many lands in Christian Europe and the Islamic East. In fact, it flourishes in the Jewish world to this day, especially in the United States and Israel. Among the numerous ketubot of the past that survived in the Jewish communities from Yemen, Iraq, and India to Turkey, Greece, and Holland, those that stand out for their artistic excellence are undoubtedly the sumptuous parchment ketubot that were created in Baroque Italy. The ketubah at upper right dates from 1660, the one at lower right from 1630. Rembrandt's picture was painted in the later 1660s. Here is a charming illustration from the ketubah of 1660. On the right, we see the angel intervening to stop Abraham from sacrificing his son Isaac. And on the left, Abraham's two servants reclining with the donkey, who is labeled beneath his belly. The bride and groom were called Baruch and Hannah, by the way, and her dowry was worth 575 scudi. That's nearly 2 kilos of gold, about $124,000. The Mercato Vecchio, or Old Market, stood just next to the ghetto. The piazza was located at the intersection of the Cardo and the Decumanus of Roman Florence, and was the fulcrum of the small civic center. The daily arrival of fresh provisions made the Mercato Vecchio the noble garden of Florence, as it was called by Antonio Pucci in the 15th century. But from the Middle Ages onwards, it had its fair share of problems in the form of overcrowding, poor hygiene, criminality, and conflicts over the use of space, typical of market areas. In the middle of the piazza, the Loggia della Beccaria, demolished in 1881, accommodated the meat market. Behind it arose the Loggia del Pesce, designed by Giorgio Vasari in 1568 to 69, and now re-erected in Piazza dei Ciompi. The gibbet, intended for the torture of the Tratti di Corda, the gibbet is on your right, acted as a pendant to the column of abundance, with the allegorical statues sculpted by Donatello in 1430, replaced in 1721 by a statue by Giovan Battista Foggini. In the crowded canvas, we recognize on the left a soldier of the Guardia dei Lanzi, and on the right, an elderly seller of cloth, possibly a Jew exercising the strazzeria, being robbed by two shady customers. This picture is an early 18th century copy after a lost original by Filippo Napolitano, which would have been painted early in the 17th century. Filippo was in Florence between 1617 and 1621. It is a very remarkable fact that in late 17th century Florence, there was a court painter to the Medici who was a Jew. This is doubly surprising, both because of the traditional Jewish suspicion of images and because of the fact that membership of guilds, such as the painters, was restricted to Christians. The artistic personality of Iona Ostilio has been painstakingly reconstructed by Pier Gabriele Mancuso, Maria Sframelli, and others, who have attached to his name a great many paintings hitherto regarded as anonymous. This is his still life with fishes and a crab, now in the deposits of the Cenacolo di San Salvi. We gather from the 17th century art historian Filippo Baldinucci that Despite the prohibitions of the law and the rules that excluded him from any kind of professional organization, Ostilio managed to join a jolly brigade of fun-loving artists and eventually to become part of the entourage of the Grand Prince Ferdinando de' Medici. Also, he had a relationship with a beautiful young Christian widow. He lived until 1695. This painting by Iona Ostilio shows a landscape with bridge bearing the Medici arms, riders and oxen fording a river. It is from the Uffizi, but has not been seen for nearly 100 years, because in 1925 it was lent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. The artist's signature below dates from 1672. Cosimo III de' Medici was 28 when he ascended the Grand Ducal throne on the death of his father in 1670. He was plump and flabby and is usually dismissed as a religious bigot and arch conservative, even though he did have some genuine scientific interests and had gone traveling in his youth. A considerable part of his political agenda was, however, directed towards the recognition of his dynastic dignity, something that had little or nothing to do with the growth and development of his state. This portrait is by Justus Sustermans. Cosimo imposed on the Jewish community numerous and frequent restrictions in repeated proclamations, requiring constant homages and offerings of money to be paid to the Catholic authorities and to the court personnel. I don't see what distinguishes these exactions from ordinary theft. It was Cosimo who decided in 1705 that far too many Jews lived outside the precincts of the ghetto and that it was time to expand. So Cosimo III embarked on a 10-year building program. Here he is in his Grand Ducal robes in a portrait by Baldassare Franceschini known as Volterrano. This was a time of growing hostility towards the Jewish community, with the reaffirmation and reimposition of the traditional canon laws, the same ones which, in theory, applied to all the Italian ghettos, and which the Medici state had officially adopted with the creation of the Florentine ghetto in 1570. But above all, with the publication of a motu proprio that on the 27th February 1705 ordered the expansion of the existing ghetto area, i.e. the creation of a new ghetto, and the forced inclusion of those Jews, as many as 105 families, who had long since moved outside the perimeter of the old ghetto. This is a picture of the interior of a synagogue by that interesting non-Jewish painter Alessandro Magnasco of around 1730. I'm not sure how much documentary value it has, though it is known that the artist stayed in Livorno, so he may have visited the synagogue there. In the center stands the celebrant, his head and shoulders covered by a fringed talit. Magnasco painted a companion piece to this one, showing a Quaker meeting, and also a picture of a Jewish funeral. Images of Jewish interiors in this period are, however, extremely rare. Alessandro Magnasco excelled in producing small, hypochromatic canvases with eerie and gloomy landscapes and ruins, or else crowded interiors peopled with small, lambent and elongated figures. The people in his paintings are frequently robbers, beggars dressed in tatters, or torturers of the Inquisition. rendered in flickering, nervous brushstrokes. Here is his self-portrait with a small selection of his pictures. To help us better understand the intensity of the exchanges, not only commercial but also cultural, between the inhabitants of the ghetto and the surrounding world in the 18th century, we possess an exceptionally important testimony. The two travel diaries of Moise Vito Capsuto, jeweler to the Grand Ducal Court, merchant, community leader, and enlightened traveler. Born in 1690 in Florence, Moise Vito Capsuto belonged to a family that had been involved for several generations in the precious stone trade. Capsuto, a jeweler like his father and many of his forebears, from a young age had visited the principal Italian commercial centers, including Livorno, Ferrara, Bologna, and Venice. It was during a sojourn in Genoa in 1723 that he met and married Rachele Cohen del Medico, and there exists a brief correspondence with her complementing the principal manuscript of the diaries. His international contacts and his being chosen by a consortium of merchants from Livorno, Venice, Aleppo, and Hamadan in Persia to deal with one of the largest diamonds ever imported into Europe. An intimate of the last Medici Grand Duke Giangastone, a close friend of Prince Eugene of Savoy, a business acquaintance of Frederick II of Prussia, of Louis XV of France, and of the leading houses of the European aristocracy, Capsuto commanded a dense network of contacts with intellectuals, merchants, and leaders, both Jewish and Christian, from Northern Europe to the Middle East, such as the Turkish Sultan's physician, Daniel de Fonseca, a friend of Voltaire, or the astronomer Edward Halley, or the composer Karl Heinrich Graun, Kapellmeister to Frederick II. He was a distinguished example of what in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire was called a Hofjude, a court Jew, less well known but no less important also in an Italian context. The portrait on the left by Giuseppe Ghislandi is not really Capsuto. It's just someone I thought he might look like. His diaries describe two long voyages. The first, undertaken from October 1733 to April 1735, to take his little son Ephraim to the Holy Land, led him to traverse the territories of the Sublime Porte from Egypt to Constantinople, returning to Italy after various sojourns in the Habsburg Empire and a long stay in Vienna. His route is marked in red on this map. In his second voyage, made between May 1741 and June 1743, Capsuto traveled to France, England, and Prussia, with a stop of almost a year in the Netherlands, where he tried without success to sell the enormous diamond to some crowned head or other. His route is marked in yellow. His text is remarkably modern, and its modernity appears particularly in the importance attributed in all its parts to amusement. He devotes much space to humorous or witty descriptions of funny episodes, and while there is no lack of dramatic moments and excitement in the course of his travels, he emphasizes above all those that provoked hilarity and laughter. Expressions such as si pigliava divertimento e si stava allegri. Ci mantenemmo tranquilli e divertiti sempre in allegria, spassi e divertimenti. Era propriamente allegria a vederli mangiare. E così si passò anche quel giorno in godiamos e allegria. Such expressions season the text of his two diaries at every turn, testifying not only to the jovial character of the author, but anticipating in literary practice what in those same years Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten gave a theoretical formulation to, with the coining of the neologism aesthetics, destined for a great future. Although Cavsuto differs from many contemporary travelers in paying less attention to details of landscape and took no interest in the picturesque, he nevertheless shows himself to be fully a child of the encyclopedic spirit of his time, systematically arranging things seen according to an order that includes as much information as possible, from alimentary customs to religious observances, from the condition of the Jews to that of women, from the character of the people to their political and commercial regimes. The fact that most of the diary is devoted to describing the world of the Goyim is a notably novel element in the Jewish literature of the time. His gaze is already that of the anthropologist and explorer. He was neither a rabbi nor a scholar, but a merchant belonging to the community's ruling class, and he was completely at his ease in the most varied contexts, in aristocratic salons like this one, or in military encampments, in Christian monasteries, or in Talmudic academies, in the mercantile exchanges of Northern Europe, or in the souks of the Middle East. For more than one reason, Cavsuto deserves to be included among the representatives of the so-called Mediterranean Enlightenment. Ever since the time of Cosimo I, who granted special permission to some Levantine Jewish friends of his, there had been Florentine Jews living outside the ghetto. Cavsuto was one of these. The frequent contacts between Jews and Christians induced Cosimo III, as we have seen, to amplify the spaces of the ghetto by constructing the so-called Ghetto Nuovo from 1705, without, however, obtaining the hoped-for result. Despite the surveillance of leaders of the Jewish community who urged obedience to the Grand Ducal decrees, at the opening of the Ghetto Nuovo in 1715, there were still 60 Jewish houses outside. The phenomenon intensified in the course of the 18th century. In 1808, the Napoleonic bureaucrats registered 390 Jews residing outside the ghetto, out of a total population of 1,100. The number increased, as is shown by the Grand Ducal census of 1841, and continued to climb in the years after 1861. The transfer of the capital to Florence and the transformations undergone by the city on that occasion facilitated further removals. This engraving shows an 18th century assembly of Sephardic Jews, that is to say, ones who came originally from the Iberian Peninsula. With the death of the last Medici Grand Duke Giangastone in 1737, Medici power in Tuscany came to an end, giving way to the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. Under the enlightened government of Pietro Leopoldo I, 1765 to 1790, Grand Ducal properties were put up for sale. The internal ghetto, that's to say the spaces intended for the Jews' residences, as opposed to the external ghetto, which was rented out to Christians, was put to auction in May 1778. The Jewish community had already, in 1750, purchased the buildings of both synagogues. On the left, you see the act putting the spaces of the internal ghetto to auction. On the right, a portrait of Pietro Leopoldo. In 1833, the entire ghetto area was bought by two rich Jewish families, the Finzi and the Rimini. The process of Jewish emancipation began under the House of Habsburg-Lorraine and continued under Napoleon Bonaparte, who repealed much anti-Semitic legislation and in 1806 convoked at Paris the so-called Grand Sanhedrin, the council held with the declared aim of combating anti-Judaism and discussing the civil rights of the Jewish minority, but tending in practice to subject the community's institutions to French imperial control. This medal was struck to commemorate the event. On the obverse, we see Napoleon's profile. The reverse shows the emperor receiving the tablets of the law from a kneeling figure, evidently based on Michelangelo's Moses. The same blasphemous iconography can be found in other images marking the event. After the fall of Napoleon, many of the old restrictions were reimposed on Tuscan Jewry, but the days of institutionalized anti-Judaism were numbered. And in 1848, the Jews of Florence were awarded full civic rights under the new constitution. They decided to mark this development with the construction of an immense new synagogue, the Tempio Maggiore, and set about collecting funds. David Levy, a president of the Jewish community, bequeathed his entire estate to the project in 1870. Construction began in 1874 and was completed 8 years later. Designed in the Moorish style that had never been used for Christian churches, the great synagogue has layers of travertine alternating with granite and a huge dome sheathed in copper that is loosely based on that of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The Moorish style served to remind Florentine Jews of the origins of Sephardic Jewry in Berber Moorish Spain. There was incidentally a much smaller Ashkenazi synagogue in Via delle Ocche near the Duomo, which lasted until the 1960s. In May 1881, the last Jewish family left their apartment in the ghetto, thus marking the end of a segregation that had lasted over 300 years. For Carnival 1888, the now empty ghetto was decorated in Chinese style and open to a paying public. 2 years previously, the theme had been the city of Baghdad. And this year, again, an Orientalist theme was chosen, the Celestial Empire. There were pagodas, gardens, dragons, and tableaux vivants, as you can perhaps just see in these 4 Alinari photographs of the Chinese carnival. Here you can see rather better a tableau vivant with people dressed up in cod Chinese costume, posing on a double staircase, apparently derived from the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. There are dragons painted on the beams of the ceiling. This is a picture of the Florence ghetto by the celebrated macchiaiolo artist Telemaco Signorini, painted in 1882. Here he is on the left in his top hat and check trousers. One day, some 6 years later, as he was wandering sorrowfully among the ruins of the ghetto, the artist was apostrophized sneeringly by a municipal engineer in charge of the demolition. Telemaco, do you weep for the porcherie coming down? No, replied the painter, I weep for the porcherie going up. With the same sharp irony, this painting shows Signorini's alignment with the thinking of the Anglo-Saxon amateurs who were his clients and who, as we shall see, sided with Vernon Lee in the nostalgic defense of the historic center. This is one of several paintings by the naïf, self-taught artist Fabio Borbottoni that document the appearance of the ghetto in the later 19th century before it was demolished. Here we see Piazza della Fonte, right in the middle of the ghetto. The tiny figure makes the well seem enormous, which it really was not. The morning sun penetrates from above. Lights and shades define the rectangular volumes of the architecture, and the sequence of arches on the right leads towards the Ghetto Nuovo. At the top of the picture, the third floor windows provide light for the synagogue of the Italian Rite. This is a watercolor of the same scene by Riccardo Meacci, who came to Florence from Siena in 1880. His studio at Via Guelfa 67 was open to street people and beggars whom he frequently painted. To the left stood the office of the Scrittoio delle Regie Possessioni, responsible for the financial and fiscal administration of the ghetto and for collecting the rents. On the right, we recognize the Voltone, the series of arches leading to the Ghetto Nuovo. Further to the right and off the picture is the building that housed the synagogue of the Sephardic Levantine Rite. Now, just to complete the picture of that fountain in the middle of the ghetto, here is an Alinari photograph taken in about 1881 from more or less the same viewpoint as the paintings by Borbottoni and Meacci. Now, this is a staged photograph, a gelatin silver print taken around 1890 in the Corte del Marcello by the photographer Giuseppe Baccali. We see a man mugging or beating up some unfortunate person, while a third man looks on, possibly sniggering. This rather ridiculous and absurd photo very clearly shows one of the two tall piers that supported the 17th century extension of the Italian Rite synagogue. The definitive demolition of the Jewish ghetto of Florence began in the summer of 1888 and lasted at least 2 years, because we know that parts of it were still standing on the 20th of September 1890, when the equestrian monument to Vittorio Emanuele II was unveiled in the new piazza named after him. On that occasion, sheets of canvas were stretched over the unsightly ruins in order not to spoil the impression of gleaming modernity. In 1932, the statue of the king on his horse, by Emilio Zocchi, was moved to the entrance of the Cascine, where it can still be seen. Here is the appallingly pompous and self-congratulatory inscription that was set up in Piazza Vittorio Emanuele in 1895. L'antico centro della città, da secolare squallore a vita nuova restituita. The old city center restored to new life after centuries of squalor. I don't know who thought up the wording of this inscription with its echo of Dante, but it annoys me every time I see it. The destruction of the old market and of the Jewish ghetto caused anger and resentment among many Florentines, and especially among the foreign community, who saw it as short-sighted, Philistine, and vandalistic. Violet Paget, who lived at Villa Palmerino and wrote under the pseudonym of Vernon Lee, was a founding member of the Society for the Protection of Old Florence. On the 15th December 1898, she wrote a long letter to the Times of London about the disemboweling of the city centre, the old market, and the Jewish ghetto. The centre of Florence, she said, including the old marketplace, Vasari's fish market, several very important and ancient churches, some beautiful and most interesting palaces of guilds and old families, and a unique ensemble of medieval streets and lanes, was not cleared or ventilated or drained or otherwise sanitated, but simply swept off the face of the earth. Not a trace remaining in the group of commonplace and inappropriate streets and the ostentatious and dreary arcaded square, she's talking about what is now Piazza della Repubblica, which arose on its site. This letter had a good effect and helped to create a climate of opinion that prevented further destruction before it was too late. Vernon Lee was assisted in her efforts by many foreign residents, such as John Temple Leader, Frederick Stibbert, and Adolf von Hildebrand. In less than 3 months, she collected over 11,000 signatures to stop the demolition. This is the brilliant portrait of her by her childhood friend, John Singer Sargent, with a drawing by him on the left and a photograph on the right. On 9th of May 1938, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini paid an official visit to Florence. By a very unpleasant and ironic coincidence, the main stop on their tour through the city took place in Piazza Vittorio Emanuele, now Piazza della Repubblica, so that the podium used by the Nazi and fascist dignitaries occupied the very space where formerly had stood the Jewish ghetto. This is a watercolor designed by Stefano Pollini for the decoration of the piazza, which, as you can see, was covered in swastikas and fasces for the occasion. During Hitler's visit, the Jewish director of Palazzo Pitti, Dr. Giorgio Castelfranco, was unceremoniously removed from his post. Looking back over the 3 centuries of segregation, the emancipated Jews must have had mixed feelings, just as klezmer music is both very, very sad and very, very happy at the same time. On the one hand, the ghetto was that old enclosure whose name we wish to forget, and that abject place where our ancestors were closed up by the intolerance of past centuries. In the words of the secretary of the Jewish community, the lawyer Dante Cohen, it was the place of segregation and social exclusion. On the other hand, it cannot be denied that the ghetto favored Jewish culture, religion, learning, and social cohesion, for it was the site of a variegated human microcosm that gave life to complex processes of internal interaction, also with the social majority. Now that I've come to the end of my talk, I would urge any of you who have found it interesting to visit the exhibition, mounted in collaboration with the Medici Archive Project and called Gli Ebrei, I Medici e il Ghetto di Firenze. It is on the top floor of Palazzo Pitti, in the space next to the Galleria d'Arte Moderna, until the 28th of January. There is a fascinating 3D model of the ghetto, which I have not shown you, and a stupendous tapestry of Joseph's dream of the wheat sheaves, to a cartoon by Bronzino. It's important to study the history of the Jewish people, not only in a Florentine context, because their safety can never be taken for granted. In Europe, there has been a resurgence of anti-Semitism. The terrible 20th century dictator committed suicide in his bunker. But as Bertolt Brecht reminded us in a play first performed in 1958, the beast that spawned him is on heat again. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Mark. That was a wonderful talk. And yes, that's the Zoomers are now with us. Hello, Zoomers. And as always, we now do the questions and answers. I'll put some more light on. Try now. Yeah. A bit more. Yeah. There we are. And in the room, the rules are you put your hand up and I bring you the microphone. Because if you don't use the microphone, people on Zoom can't hear you. And those on Zoom, you can either unmute and talk to us or put something in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. In fact, I can see some stuff in the chat already. But we'll come to that in a moment. Is anyone in the room wanting to get started? Got someone at the back there.
Thank you for your interesting talk. How big in square meters was the original ghetto and then the second? And what was the population at the initial and later, just to understand the context? And yeah,
How many square meters it was, but I'm afraid I don't. I know that from the maps, it was doubled at the end of Cosimo's work in 1715. It was doubled in size, and you can see this clearly from maps. But I'm not very good at surveying.
Okay. There's a bit of controversy on the chat about whether the photographs from Eastern Europe are connected to the ghetto. Okay, never mind. More questions or comments from the room or coming in on the Zoom. Got various fan mail coming in. Okay. Great lecture, thank you, from Judith Sparks. Here we are.
Oh, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. Do you know anything about the history of the Jewish cemeteries in Florence? Because the cemeteries, because I know there's a cemetery out in San Frediano.
That's right.
Occasionally, and I wondered when that. So, and the cemeteries, I assume, are all outside the city walls. But I just wondered if you knew anything about their history.
Yes, no, I don't. I'm afraid. I know it's possible to visit the one in San Frediano on Sunday morning. I've only looked over the fence.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Sorry, do we have any like contemporary accounts about how general Florentines, non-Jews, treated the Jewish people of the ghetto interno? I know that the ghetto externo was commandeered by like Christian businesses, and I wanted to know if there was any like contemporary accounts that kind of showed the dynamics between the ghetto interno and the ghetto externo.
Yes, that's a very good question. Again, I must plead ignorance. The essays in the catalogue on the exhibition have assembled a lot of documentation about it. I can't recall that there's discussion about that, however.
Okay, there's lots coming in on the chat, so I'll read some of them out. Thomas Harding, when the ghetto was created, how were the Jews in Tuscany beside Livorno and Pisa forced into the ghetto? Jumping around, what can you tell us about anti-Jewish hatred, pogroms in Florence during the time of the ghetto? How do you think the people of Florence today think of the Jewish ghetto? Any views on that?
I see.
Yeah.
Which is that?
Yes, yeah.
No, it's gone.
Oh, it's moved up. It's about whether the pogroms going on, how were they forced into the ghetto at the time? How much violence was there, I suppose?
Well, they certainly were forced into the ghetto. They certainly were forced into the ghetto in Florence, but in Livorno and Pisa, they managed to escape. Ferdinando I was keen to establish Livorno as a free port, and the restrictions were relatively mild, and the same goes for Pisa.
Question from James Buchan: were any of the Florentine Jews sent into Germany or Poland by the Nazis, or indeed the fascists? Do you know?
Well, they were, weren't they?
There were transportations. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there are those little plaques at the station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A question I have, I don't know whether you know the answer. In the woodcut of the Jewish people at the towards the end of the ghetto, they were walking around holding little sort of placards. Yeah, what were those?
I'm not sure what they
Yeah.
are. They're small rectangles with a handle.
Yeah, they all seem to have them.
Yeah.
Anyone know what those were? No? No, collective wisdom doesn't cover it. All right. Any more questions in the room? Or thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. It was very interesting as usual. If I may add, with your permission, to the question of the gentleman about the cemeteries. Since I made a study on the cemeteries in Florence, I may add that at the end of the 1700s, before Napoleon proclaimed this law, which obliged the burials outside the cities, already the Pietro Leopoldo government had issued a law in which it was provided a new cemetery also for the Jewish people, just outside the city walls. Also because the one in San Frediano was getting a little bit too small to adjust all the Jewish people that were dying. And anyway, it was a law of Pietro Leopoldo.
Thank you very much. Okay, any more in the room? Is anyone on Zoom wants to unmute and talk to us? We always like to hear the voices in the room. Not, but they're quite shy. They don't do it. But, talking about being shy on the Zoom, don't be shy to make a little contribution if you feel like it. Sarah's put up the link as my weekly plea. The 90 people in the room have all paid to be here, and the 90 on the Zoom need to do that bit too. Okay, on which note, if there's no more questions, do we have one? No, you're just waving. Ellie does not want to say anything tonight. It's time to go for wine for those in the room.
Is it this week?
This week, well, we're just coming towards the end of our season partnership with Castiglione del Bosco. And I think tonight we've pulled out some of their Brunello di Montalcino, so it might be quite good. And yeah, so enjoy that. And thanks to Penny again for the sponsorship. Thanks to Mark for a fantastic lecture. Thanks to the Zoomers from all over the world. It's always lovely to have you with us. And we'll see you, those in Florence, on Monday for Jeannie Marshall. Looking forward to it. Bye.
Okay.